Good evening. My name is Ashley Murphy. I am the founder and principal of Arete Wealth Strategists, and this evening's presentation is going to be, as you can see right here, the Aussie Expat Guide to Retiring in the US. I think you'll find this to be pretty useful. I welcome your feedback at the conclusion of tonight's presentation, but be sure to understand that this does not constitute specific advice to you. This is general advice of an educational nature, and you are advised to seek your own professional financial, tax, and investment advice before making any decisions. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a tri-citizen, born in the UK, raised in Australia, and I've been living here in the US for the last 16 years. Went to the University of Queensland, my great alma mater, where we're privileged to have Dr. Karen Alpert from joining us on tonight's presentation as an attendee, so we won't be hearing from her this evening. Moved to the US in 2005. I've done the CFP CFA study. I was the secretary of the Next Gen. I've been a conference speaker to the Financial Planning Association and other dealer groups in Australia. I've been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and a bunch of other places. First of all, I love being a financial advisor, making a difference in people's lives and figuring out how they can enjoy as much freedom and possibility as what their money and the various choices they've made in their life will allow them to. That's why I do what I do. So what's Arete Wealth Strategies? It really consists of two brands. We're fee only, which means unlike other financial advisors you will encounter in the US, we act in a fiduciary capacity 100% of the time. Cloud-based, virtual and in-person, being a lot more virtual in the last 2 months, I can tell you that. We do have a presence in San Francisco as well as Minneapolis, make it out to San Francisco about every quarter, Australia every year or twice a year, and New York annually also. So as you can see here, the intersection of the work that we do is really with Aussie expat business owners and execs. Arete Wealth Strategies was the brand I got started first in 2013, and then 2 years later, Arete Wealth Strategies Australia got going. I've also got a graduate diploma in financial planning in Australia, which, to my knowledge, makes me the only financial planner that is educated in the systems of both countries. So here's an example of the kinds of issues that I work with clients on. And enough talk. Those regular to my presentation will know that that's the usual intro that I give before we get on to the substance of this evening's presentation. Okay, so we're going to talk about how and when to get your superannuation, what's going on with the currency, with the Australian dollar versus the US dollar, Australian investment property, decision to hold or sell, Social Security and the Australian aged pension. What do government pensions look like for the retiring American in Australia? Sorry, for the retiring Australian in America. It's easy to get one's tongue twisted there. US retirement accounts, what are they? How do they work? And retirement income planning strategies applicable to the US. All right, so when can you access your superannuation? This is a topic top of mind for many Australians in the United States. And really, it boils down, there's a couple answers. It's very complicated, but I'm going to give an answer that I think is applicable to 95% of the people who are joining us on this webinar. And that is, if you're between the ages of 60 and 65, age 60 is a condition of release so long as you have ceased employment. If you commence employment with another employer between ages 60 and 65, you may not access those super funds, but you may access those funds that you have accumulated up until that point in time. From the age of 65 onwards, things get a little easier, and that is the very act of turning 65 is considered to be a condition of release in itself. It's important to note here an exception. So can you get to your super before the age of 60? That's the question that I'm sure is on many people's minds. Two answers, yes. One of which is there's the so-called transition to retirement And that only kicks in really in your late 50s. It is dependent on when you were born, but I believe it's about age 58, if I'm correct, in 2020, where you may access it, but the tax treatment is not as it is from age satisfying the conditions of release you see here, where it's tax-free. That's the treatment of the ATO's treatment, I should say, of your super. We'll talk about the IRS's treatment in a moment, but from age 60, provided you're no longer working, and age 65, it's coming out tax-free. If you're taking a TTR, a transition to retirement income stream before age 60, and I believe commencing around the age of 58, may still be 57 and change, then there are some tax-free amounts you may withdraw, but you do run into thresholds where it will be taxable. One thing to note here, I meant to also mention the other circumstance under which you may access your super prior to one of these other age-based conditions of release, and that would include a major hardship withdrawal, and that's what prompted me to mention this one right here. Due to COVID-19, you may access up to $10,000 in the 1920 tax year, and then another $10,000 in the subsequent tax year. Hopefully, no one on this call is affected by that. Okay, is there a minimum amount you must take each year? Yes, there is, in fact. And it's not unlike the required minimum distribution situation that we have in the US. So you can see here, I've linked it to this other table. It's been reduced in the COVID years, 2020 and 2021, by 50%, but these are the default minimum drawdown rates that you've got to take from your super account. Okay, so back here. Next topic, moving on from super and the ATO's tax treatment, we will come back to talk about the IRS's tax treatment. Should you have life insurance through your super account while in the US? This is more applicable, I would say, to folks in the accumulation phase, really gearing up for retirement. The short answer is no. No. This would make my dirty dozen list of things what not to do as an Aussie expat Aussie expat living in the United States. It's much more expensive to obtain insurance, life insurance in Australia, even though the premiums are not tax deductible in the US. If your death benefits, unless you have binding nominations, which must be renewed every 2 years, may be determined by the trustee who even gets your super death benefits and your super account. And indeed, as I personally experienced, if you're not a so-called tax dependent of the deceased, then you can get hit with a hefty tax bill on the distribution of those life insurance benefits, none of which apply in the case of US life insurance, which is dictated by contract law, and it goes to the beneficiary stated in the life insurance policy, tax-free. Would that necessarily be tax-free to someone living in Australia 100% of the time? No. There are certain things that may come up with that, probably mostly only estate tax that I can think of. But we're not talking about folks in Australia tonight. We're talking about folks in America. And so you would be much better off to obtain your life insurance in the US to save some money. Now, what if you have a self-managed super fund and you're living in the US? You might have a problem. You might have a problem if you don't have a resident trustee in Australia, because that would fail that particular test. Okay, I alluded to this earlier. Tax treatment of those distributions. Essentially, if you meet the conditions of release, the over age 60 and quit your job, don't intend to go back to, over the age of 60, quit your job, and then over the age of 65, then you're essentially getting that out tax-free. It does include, this is a technical note that I wish I had deleted actually, and that is to do with on the accumulation side. So there is a tax-free and a taxable component. Essentially, your concessional contributions comprise your taxable component, and your non-concessionals are your tax-free component. And there's also another component that rarely comes up. In fact, I've never even seen it other than in a textbook, and that's applicable to government employees. And we won't go into that tonight. Okay, so as you heard me say, it's tax-free. It's a beautiful system. I think, believe it's Mercer, global pension consulting firm, ranks the Australian retirement system as one of the top systems in the world. And this is why the tax deductible contributions into super, very low tax tax environment within super, and then tax-free on the way out. Now, that's all well and good that the ATO doesn't tax it, but how does the IRS treat it? Not quite as nicely at all. And that's because the IRS doesn't view superannuation as being a complying or a qualifying retirement account. It views it as either a foreign grantor trust or as an employee benefits trust. And that is probably the subject of its own webinar to talk about that. And I would say I'm really sharpening my axe and getting the word out there about an abusive tax treatment where, well, I should take that back, not an abusive tax treatment, but many taxpayers will shop around for a better tax treatment, but it should be stated that that's presently being litigated by the IRS against a former financial advisor and real estate investment trust promoter who had taken that position, and we're eagerly awaiting the result of this alternate view that in fact superannuation isn't taxable at all when viewed through the lens of the tax treaty. So we'll wait and see what the outcome of that is. In any event, it is important to say something here. So while I would much prefer that the tax impact to the non-resident Aussie be tax-free, if that was or is shown indeed to be the case, the way that I view it and most leading practitioners view it is that it's not. It's either one of a foreign grantor trust or employee benefits trust, to do with a variety of tests. First and foremostly to do with who's made the majority of the contributions to the account. Are you deemed a highly compensated employee? And other factors also. And I would say, to keep it really simple, the tax treatment is not unlike that of perhaps a traditional IRA versus a Roth IRA. And so with an employee benefits trust, while the employer contribution, your superannuation guarantee, that 9.5% that your employer is mandated to contribute, will be taxable in both instances. The difference with an employee benefits trust is that the growth isn't taxable. The growth isn't taxable with an employee benefits trust. Well, that's all well and good, but it's taxable on the way out. So when you distribute it, you've essentially got a taxable gain on everything above your basis in that trust. Foreign grantor trust is not as tax-friendly, and it's not as tax-friendly because you're paying the tax on the contributions and the growth in the account. That's the key here. There's the difference on the growth of the account on an annual basis all throughout, well, essentially whenever there's growth. The good news comes in retirement when your basis has been stepped up so high that there really isn't a whole lot more to be taxing you on. But it's disadvantageous primarily because you're getting hit with that additional tax, the growth and the contributions, in your years of higher income, in your working years. And so that's where it really loses out. Okay, superannuation. How best to transfer these distribution proceeds? Remember, tonight's presentation is about the Aussie living in the US. So how do we move those funds over to the US in the first place? You would think I would, but I never get bored of bringing up my favorite foreign exchange conversion spreadsheet that we have right here. So what do we have? We have a Google Sheet where we've got a formula here linking essentially live interbank exchange rate. Interbank, that's what the banks exchange at with no fee. You could call it the pure rate. And then what we have here is, if let's say you had $1 million Australian dollars in your superannuation account, you wanted to get that over to the US because you don't live in Australia, you're sick of having to deal with passive foreign investment corporation rules and FBAR filings and all the annoying administration that goes on and being a US person for purposes of tax. So you move it over to Australia. If you're a bank, that's what your $1 million would convert to in US dollars as of today. However, none of us are banks, so we have to choose the next best alternative. We work with Interactive Brokers and have also negotiated a client-only rate with AFEX for a 0.2% spread on the interbank rate. The next best and best that I know of retail rate that non-clients would get is 3 times as much, and that's over at TransferWise. AFEX, actually, their retail rate's also the same. So 60 basis points or 0.6%. On that $1 million, that's costing you $6,000 when you compare that to the interbank rate, or with Interactive Brokers, it's costing you $200. And then you can see here the differences. So if you were moving it over through IB versus AFEX, it would cost you $1,800 more. And if you're moving it over through TransferWise, compared with IB, it's a $5,800 expense that you're incurring. Okay. So the first tip here is to, as you just saw, is to obtain the lowest interbank spread. Some people, not so commonly, but they get hung up on commissions. They say, hold on, does that charge a commission? All of them do. They're not doing it for love. These are profit-making businesses. They must make money somehow. How do they do it? Mostly through the spread, because retail investors aren't aware that that is the business model, very much like the mortgage model that banks have, where they're charging a spread on the rate at which they can borrow money from the Reserve Bank. Use limit orders to obtain a better rate for each trade. What is a limit order? A limit order is where you specify a certain threshold. You'd say, I only want to convert my Aussie dollars to US dollars when the rate passes through, let's say, 66 cents. Is it there today? No, but it may pass through that, and that trade would only execute once it hits that level. What's the downside of that? Well, if it doesn't hit the level, then you might be making a market trade at a lower rate. Nevertheless, I do have a whole presentation that I've done just on foreign exchange, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Implementing a systematic conversion schedule. Does anybody know what the future holds for foreign exchange? I have my opinions, and I'm going to share them with you in tonight's webinar. But no one knows. No one knows. And so you'll find in the advice that I give, I tend to be pretty conservative. I err on the side of, I focus on what I think is realistic, and then just eke it back a little bit to be a bit conservative. And so for that reason, I encourage and practice on behalf of clients to convert in systematic amounts. We might set a target. We'll look at history and where the rate's been, where we see it going, and say, okay, right now, I think would be a great time to do a conversion, or perhaps not. Let's just do a smaller conversion. And then that way, we're dollar cost averaging that rate over time. More of an advanced strategy right here, and something we do for higher end clients, would be what's called a costless collar strategy, which enables us to lock in a rate for a period of time. And so really, regardless of what the actual rate does, we've locked it in using a set of option contracts. Okay, so here's my favorite. Anyone who's familiar and watching my webinars will know that Daily FX is my go-to resource for the exchange rate. I think they've got a great tool. Let's just talk about the experience of the Aussie dollar here for a moment. So what we can see is that the highest rate that we've hit all year was actually really easy to remember. It was the 1st of January. We hit 70 cents momentarily. And then I believe we commenced the very same trajectory that we've been on for years, in fact, more like a decade, with the Aussie dollar against the US dollar. We continued a gradual decline. And then suddenly, smack bang, COVID-19 happened, or at least came to our attention. Oh my goodness, this has hit the shores of the United States. It's spreading like wildfire. And there was a rush to the global currency safe haven, the US dollar, and people abandoned their Aussie dollars en masse before the Federal Reserve issued currency swap lines with the Reserve Bank of Australia. And Australia escaped the worst of the COVID crisis and releases from lockdown and is essentially getting back on its feet quicker, talking about a trans-Tasman bubble and talking about what prospects the economy might hold from here on. Scott Morrison was quoted in an interview on Monday talking about the three drivers he sees of the Aussie dollar going forward. He's speaking about tourism, mining, and international students. Those three answers made me almost nauseous because each one of them you can poke holes in. So let's talk about mining. Okay, Australia was the one that first came up with the idea to investigate China as being the source of the COVID crisis and how they handled it. We've been slapped with 60% embargoes on barley, and there was some other embargo, or excuse me, sanction or tariff that was applied. However, their demand for other raw materials has not changed. In fact, it's said to be back at pre-COVID levels. So Scott Morrison says mining, but with a pretty strong caveat. And the susceptibility that we have, given what economists call a monopsony, not a monopoly, a monopsony, where you have one dominant customer as opposed to one dominant supplier in the case of a monopoly. So that's the first problem I see with mining and Australia returning to its former strength based on that. Second, tourism. There was a disheartening article about in the Financial Times about Australia's the longest ever bull market for any economy ever has now ended for Australia. And they profiled some operators up in the Blue Mountains, and they were saying how there's just been a trickle of demand. And you can imagine when you think about all of the countries that visited Australia, domestic tourism and tourists from New Zealand are not going to make that up. So that's a second strike. And third strike is international students, and I almost don't need to say anything about that, given that many international students simply cannot come. Will they return? Probably. But that's a whole other topic for another time. So the three drivers of the recovery, I'm a little leery of. And so for that reason, I'm going to share with you what I see in my tea leaves. And they are that I think we will see a temporary reprieve and strengthening of the Aussie dollar over the next month. That would be my forecast. Next month, maybe 2 months, and that's going to be relative to the US. Why? Because the US has a very strong growth prospects, in my opinion. I don't think Australia does. And so it's going to continue that gradual weakening. But Australia is also, the United States is also not dealing with this COVID crisis nearly as well. And so I think we're very likely to see a rebound and then possibly a weakening in the desire for a second lockdown, given that that is not a sustainable economic strategy. It's a very tough topic. I appreciate there's many nuances and many different views, but I don't think anyone can argue that it is sustainable to lock down the world's economy indefinitely. So much of this you heard me just say a moment ago. I was talking about the relative performance of the US versus Australia, and then there's also China. China seems to be doing well. It's getting back up on its feet. It no longer has a supply problem. It has a demand problem, meaning its customers of its finished goods are no longer buying the things that it sells. And this was the point that I was making here a moment ago. And this is another point here in the chart. The chart is making an argument about what's called the carry trade. And it was the case for a long time, actually, up until recently, that I'm thinking the early part of the, say, 2010 through 2018, where Australia enjoyed a higher interest rate than what the United States did. That added a natural desire, if you're going to hold savings, to hold them in Australia, we can earn a higher rate of interest. Well, that has gone away, because when they're both zero, why would you bother holding it in a country you're not a resident of? And holding that very cash is forcing you to file FBARs every year. And as I said to a client just today, which is worthy of repeating here, These clients held $50,000 in Australian currency just because they're thinking of returning in a few years. And I said, so let's go through this thought exercise for a moment. What interest rate is that paying? Well, next to nothing, basically. If not exactly nothing, then next to nothing. What does having to pay a specialist tax advisor and file FBARs cost you every year? Are you seeing that ROI, the return on investment from holding that Australian currency? No? Well, maybe that's your answer if you see yourself in the US in the long term, as they did. Australian real estate. Here's an oldie goldie topic. Aussies love talking about it. So pros and cons of holding your investment real estate as an Aussie planning to retire in the US. Let's go through the pros. Well, regular income. Well, not regular and totally consistent if we're looking at a weakening exchange rate, but hopefully your tenants are still paying and there's some regular income. Capital gains potential, certainly, but again, with the economic prospects that I just highlighted, I'm not so sure about that either. And also considering from prior multiple webinars that I've done on it, Australia is also, and New Zealand are also considered to be some of the most expensive real estate locations relative to affordability in the world and remain that way. So long-term bull case, not strong. Cons, taxation of income as non-resident, so you get hit with 32.5% income tax, assuming you're making a profit at all, which has been exceedingly rare for anyone that's bought in the past 10 years. You're getting taxed a third from the first dollar, which only increases from there, up to 37%. There's also no CGT concession. That was eliminated in 2012, so you're paying 100% at an ordinary income rate, or I should say at your marginal rate, for any gain that you have. And as we're discovering right now, hopefully there's a last minute Hail Mary that comes through, but the main resident exemption will also be going away. So I don't know what the bull case is for holding property as a non-resident Aussie expat living in the US. I just don't know. And there's practically no advice topic I get onto where I talk as plainly as that. You've also got to deal with foreign exchange and the fluctuations there, and dealing with property management from overseas. All right, next, is it the right time to think of selling? It is retrospective. Okay, what is, oh, sorry, this is to do with the main residence exemption. Details on that. Sorry, I don't think that was fully formed, but is it the right time to think of selling? Is it the right time? Gosh, well, I don't think you're going to get in under the wire in having a property under contract before June 30th at this point in time. So that's probably not possible. When might be a better time to sell? I don't think waiting is going to improve when we look at the possibility for capital gains, when we look at the foreign exchange rate. I just don't see it, and I hate to be negative, but I don't think waiting is going to improve, materially improve your proceeds, your net proceeds. If you plan to, regardless of what I just said, and you have some extenuating circumstance, and you plan to hold it anyway, how might you incorporate that into your US retirement income plan? Well, first, when we're talking about, I love this. Now we're getting on to some of my favorite topics, retirement income planning. I absolutely love it. We're dealing with an equation. We're seeking to solve an equation. How do we maximize your enjoyment in life for as long as you live? Which essentially boils down to what's the most amount of money that we can draw from your portfolios and other guaranteed income sources for as long as you live? Well, there's an unknown in that equation. How long are you going to live? Does anyone know how long they're going to live? No. Only your maker knows that. There are, however, informed ways to get an estimate. Look at your family, your own health. Two indicators I look at would be Living to 100, written by an MD who has gotten on that longevity bandwagon. And then also consider if you've recently or in the past 5 or 10 years completed a life insurance application, what rating did you receive? Because remember, if anyone is in the business of determining life expectancies and rating that risk appropriately, it would be life insurers. So what risk did you get? What risk rating did you get? Okay, next step in putting together a retirement income plan is to model out your 3 phases of retirement. And those are the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. And they are defined by essentially your health and your energy. So higher travel, discretionary spending in your go-go years, that decreases a bit in your slow-go years, and your no-go years, your expenses actually go up, and that's correlated to your health expenses, as we can see here in what the researchers here, David Blanchett, a favorite academic of mine from Morningstar, he talks about the retirement spending smile. And as you can see here in constant dollars, for the age 65 retiree, their spending is actually decreasing. Bottoms out. Whoop, once that goes away, I'll tell you when that bottoms out. Bottoms out in the 80s and then picks up again with the additional healthcare and long-term care related expenses in the 90s. But where does this money go? How is it actually spent? Here was another piece of research taken from the Employee Benefits Research Institute showing just how those expenses change over time. Okay, next, if you plan to hold your Australian real estate and how best to incorporate it into your retirement income plan, we need to think about risk management. I saw a fantastic article in the Wall Street Journal late last year, and it was an article about from a report by the Society of Actuaries. Who are actuaries? They are the propeller heads that, work at insurance companies, determining the probability of certain risks occurring. And the article in the Wall Street Journal was prompted by a letter to the editor that said, what are the major spending shocks that happen in retirement that I'm not planning for? And here they were. Major home repairs. Major home repairs. We just got a roof put in our house last year because we had an awful ice dam issue from the winter before last. And I found out firsthand just what a new roof costs. It costs about $25,000. If you began to experience a leaky roof that was flooding your home, that would become a rather urgent expense, of course, or many other major things that might happen in your home. Dental expenses, this is US specific, remember. So Medicare does not cover dentistry. Significant out-of-pocket medical bills or prescription drugs. And actually the biggest one, which I don't think is on here, it's actually helping a loved one. It's actually helping a loved one is the biggest or the largest expense that someone might include. But that's kind of out of the scope of what we can talk about here. But if you're retiring in America, as tonight's presentation is about, then that's what we're concerned with, is what the situation looks like here. At age 65, you move on to Medicare, the US government's program introduced by Lyndon Johnson in the 60s to do with providing universal healthcare coverage for senior citizens. Is it perfect? No. You still need to obtain a Medicare supplement policy. A, B, and I believe it's D are the specific coverages that you need, because each of those letters covers a very specific kind of medical service. So it's a major expense, obviously, living in the US. This is a link over to the article that we did on that very same topic. You can find that here on our blog. Placement costs, healthcare expenses. So it's our advice, of course, that you would make an accrual for health, for maintenance expenses, relatives in need, and then, of course, required minimum distributions. There it is. All right, next, dental, we spoke about that. Long-term care. Of all of the personal risks that we face, the highest, higher than other than life insurance, right? Because we've all got the same probability of triggering that event. But for long-term care, compared with, say, disability, for instance, or a major car crash, your house burning down, this is by far the most probable. So if you're over the age of 65, you have a greater than 40% chance of needing long-term care. Now, that doesn't mean ending up in a nursing home. Long-term care takes many different forms. 10% of those individuals will be there for more than 5 years. And of those who needed care, The average stay was 2 to 3 years. If you consider the cost, the astonishing cost, which I can imagine COVID has only sent those costs through the roof, then this is a major issue that needs to be addressed. I assisted a client in placing a policy to take care of that early this year. Actually, it was earlier last month, as a matter of fact. And that policy had the flexibility to pay cash to a home health aide. So it does not require someone actually going into a facility. And it's always at a time like this when I talk about placing insurance that I love to remind people that I'm fee only, and so I receive no commission for doing that. I do that because it's the right thing to do. Okay, back to real estate and figuring out how it figures into your long-term retirement income plan. So first you need to determine what your reliable source of income are. That would probably include that very property that we're talking about, Social Security, company pensions. Do you have any buffer assets to withstand a market downturn? So the academics, one of my other favorites, Wade Pfau, PhD professor at the American College, he points to home equity lines of credit, that's what a HELOC stands for, and a whole life insurance policy cash value. What if you experienced a major market downturn? Let's say you happen to be retiring, say mid-March 2020, just to pick a random year, and you retired into a rotten market. It quickly recovered, I might add, but just for the sake of recency, let's use that example. Well, gosh, the worst thing you could do would be to draw down your policy at that moment in time, because we're turning a paper loss into a permanent loss. You don't need to do that if you have a buffer asset, and that's where the HELOC and the whole life policy come in. So you need your let's say your quarter's worth of spending. So you take it from the buffer asset, wait for the market to recover. By gosh, look at that. We only needed unprecedented federal stimulus and the CARES Act and paycheck protections and EIDLs and whatever else. And suddenly we're back 10% below the all-time high that we hit in February 19th of 2020. So now would be the time to consider that more balanced distribution of your retirement accounts in drawing that income. Be sure to, in your cash flow modeling, to consider any major buy-sell events. Are you going to downshift or upshift, for that matter, buy a home in the mountains or by the lake? You need to think about and use your total investable proceeds. Don't forget one-offs like inheritances, of course. If we were to be really brief about this, we would say use a 4% sustainable withdrawal rate. Do I use that? No, I don't. But if you were going to do that, like I said, this is for general educational informational purposes only and not specific advice. If you were going to be doing a back-of-the-napkin retirement income plan, then that's what Bangham's research of 1991 would show is a safe withdrawal rate. There's been many articles to criticize that, and there's many ways to improve it. But do keep in mind, 4% is gross, not net. So 4% is really 3% going in your pocket after you pay Uncle Sam 1% off the top. Run a sensitivity analysis to see how long that money will last. I forgot to go back to that in my earlier slide, but I meant to mention you'll also want to run a basic, comfortable, and dream retirement scenario, because remember, this is like a beautiful and complicated equation where we're trying to optimize for the most amount of money for as long as you live. And so that's where the Monte Carlo analysis will come into it to determine your chances of success. Okay, next, Social Security. What's the deal here? You have to pay into it for 10 years, and you'll qualify even if you're on a visa. Even if you're on a visa, it's a beautiful, well, beautiful in some ways and very flawed in others. We tend to discount the amount that someone will receive. Someone retiring in more than 10 years, we tend to discount the amount that we expect them to receive by about 25%, given the known shortcomings and deficiencies in the funds there. When is the best time to take Social Security? I would say, if you were listening to this, I'd say age 70 if you can afford to take it, but that's contingent on a number of things. As you can see here, you can take Social Security from as early as age 62, but you're locking in a lower rate permanently. You're locking that rate in. You may take the benefit as late as 70, but there's no benefit for doing it. Most people's so-called full retirement age right now will be age 67. And so the government will give you an 8% increase in your so-called fully insured amount from age 67 through to 70. That's about the best guaranteed investment growth you'll find anywhere, 8% per year from 67 to 70. So if you can afford to do it, then do it. Otherwise, it really depends on your life expectancy, coming back to that unknown that we began this conversation with, to do with retirement income planning. Really good to, of course, plan for a realistic assumption, but then hedge that bet and add another 5 or 10 years onto that. Okay, so a couple, they might both delay their claims. If you've got a major difference in earning power, then it may make sense for the spouse to collect their benefit while the higher income earner waits for their benefit to increase, and then I might have to check that. I apologize. I think that went away just a couple of years ago. That's the file and suspend strategy, where you could take one of your benefits and then swap to the worker benefit. I think that's gone away. Excuse me. But essentially, that's the long and short of it. Is there is a little bit of optimization to be done in choosing which spouse claims when, but mostly the short answer is age 70 is where the game is at. Will you qualify for the Australian age pension as an Aussie in the US? No, you won't. Why? Because you're in the US and you're not in Australia. That's part of the answer. And then there's also these other things that we see right here. Must be 66, need to be in Australia for 10 years in total. And at least 5 of these years, there must be no break in your residence. In any event, if you're here in the US, you're not in Australia, therefore no. Okay, now moving on, US retirement accounts. Here's what we have taken from my 2020 key financial data sheet, which you can find at arete-wa.com under our media tab. So you see here all the different US retirement accounts and how much you can contribute. If you're a business owner, you may contribute the full $57,000 that you see right there. If you are a W-2 employee, you may contribute $19,500. What accounts for the difference in those two numbers, the $57,000 and $19,500, is the employer contribution. So thus, if you're an employer and you wear 2 hats, you're both an employee and a business owner, you can do all 57, subject to various discrimination tests, long and involved, way beyond the scope of tonight's presentation. Or, as you heard me say, for an employee, you're looking at that $19,500. Depending on how much you make as an independent contractor or business owner, the particular retirement plan will change. First, it starts with a plain old traditional IRA. Provided your spouse isn't a participant in a 401k or a plan at work, we'll get onto that in the next slide, you may contribute up to, as you can see right here, $6,500 into, sorry, I think it's 6,000 into your traditional IRA. There we see it in the middle of the page here. You can contribute 6,000. Now let's say you make a little more money, then I would say move on to a simple IRA. With a simple, you can contribute 13,500. No setup costs, no fancy reports to file at the end of the year. Okay, next, if you're doing really well, then you might consider moving on and getting a solo 401k. If you've got employees, that gets complicated all of a sudden because you've got to share the wealth, that discrimination testing that I mentioned earlier. And then the big granddaddy of them all, as I mentioned, oh, sorry, I didn't mention this, but I will now. So in 1979, the 401k came into existence, and that was intended to be that cherry on the cupcake. That cherry on the cupcake to incentivize key employees. And that was what retirees got, was they got that cherry and they got the cupcake, and that was going to see them all the way through retirement. Well, then through the 80s and 90s, we saw corporate America realize, well, gosh, we're on the hook for paying that benefit. No matter what happens in our investment experience, we must still pay those benefits to those retirees. And that isn't very attractive to us. So what did they do? They cut the line and they gave up their pensions, which meant that we're now left with just the cherry and no longer a cupcake. And so that's what we have is the US retirement system, which, going back to the Mercer University of Melbourne ranking of the global retirement systems, does not rank nearly as high. And so for my clients, if they're getting started, say in their 30s, mid 30s, and they haven't really contributed anything to retirement, I'm going to say maxing out your 401k is just the beginning, because it alone, as a W-2 employee with $19,500 a year, ain't going to be enough. Okay, next, this is also taken from a key financial data sheet. You see it here, 6,000 for traditionals, a few more rules on what limits those contributions. This is a slide I think you'll love. I think you'll love it. So this is how to contribute, how much to what account. Okay, well, it was, and that disappeared. Okay, and we've used some pretty crude assumptions here. If you're a California or New York resident making $550,000, then this is the priority. Why did I choose such an income level? Because different opportunities arise at different income levels. I'll say when the different opportunities would go away at different income levels. So there's your 401k. That's the first thing that you want to do. Next, your flexible spending accounts or HSAs. These are tax deductible. Your backdoor Roth. Now that doesn't travel well. Please note the disclaimer down the bottom there. I would not recommend that if you're going back to Australia. But remember, tonight is not for people returning to Australia. It's for people planning on retirement here. Next, after tax long-term capital gains. So that's your old taxable account. And then at the top of the chart here is your cash value life insurance or your no-load variable annuity. Now, I am always very particular in how I describe that. That's the last good place to go. I didn't say it's a bad place to go. It's just the last good place to go. There's many, many good contracts out there. However, they're mostly missold. And often folks that are paid by commission, they view life insurance as being the financial equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, and it's good for absolutely anything. And I think it has its place, but as you see here, it's really at the back of the queue. So these first two are tax deductible. If you're getting beat up by the tax man, then these accounts certainly make sense to contribute to. And if you've got extra cash, thinking of the long term, then these other accounts make sense. Okay, so retirement tax asset classes. Here's the next thing we need to consider. We have the tax asset class. I call them the retirement tax asset classes, and there's three of them. There's your ordinary income, there's your capital gains, and your tax advantaged sources that you see right there. We want to have different buckets to pull from because in any given year, your expenses may fluctuate a little bit, and wouldn't it be nice to avoid being pushed up into a punitive tax bracket because you didn't have any money in that bucket that you could draw from to smooth out that tax rate over the course of your life. There's, of course, backdoor Roth IRA strategies. Again, makes sense for folks staying in the US, doesn't make sense for moving back to Australia. Thank you. That is tonight's webinar. Next month, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to be talking about Americans and returning Australians retiring in Australia and looking at many of the same topics, but throwing in estate planning and also viewing it from an Australian angle. That does get a little more complicated. I wonder if we'll even need to do a third webinar on this because what you get oftentimes is the returning Aussies. If you're an American citizen, it changes things because the US is the only country other than Eritrea that has a citizenship-based tax system. So that's a bit tricky. Key financial data sheet, you heard me mention that. We're pumping out white papers now. I'm very pleased to say that I promise only 2 weeks away from the pros and cons of managed fund investing in Australia versus the US. If you want to find out more about my firm's services, what we do, who we help, then go here, click on the Get Started, and we've designed a wizard to help you figure out how to get started. That's it. Let me hear some questions for those that are still on the line. Okay. Melissa asks, 2 minutes ago, yes, indeed we shall. Thank you for the quality experience and right attitude. I feel comfortable. Well, thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to just stay around for another few moments and see if some more questions roll in, because often people have a little bit of stage frightness or something like that that holds them up from submitting their questions. Thank you, Sandy. I appreciate it. We'll see you next month. Thank you, Dr. Alpert. And sign up, by the way, for Fix the Tax Treaty. fixthetaxtreaty.org, I believe it is, or .org.au to stop this punitive global citizenship-based tax system the US has. What if you make 200,000 and not 500,000? Richard asks. Yep, good question. And I should have done a better job in explaining that. How would that work? Really, it depends on your tax filing status too. So really at 200,000, that's the one, fixedtax.org. Okay. Thank you, Gregory, appreciate it. So really the name of the game, if you're at 200,000, married, filing joint, certainly single, the name of the game is going to be about tax deductibility. You may not have the surplus cash flow to consider these alternatives. If you did, then you'd move up that hierarchy. That's how I would answer that question. You'd move up and fund that hierarchy as your cash allowed. Okay. Oh, Q&As. People are using the Q&A. Talk to someone further. Someone asks, I'm not sure. Anonymous asks, how does taxes on inheritance money work? Well, Anonymous, you're welcome to join me at some future date when we do the estate planning webinar. Stephen Cowell says, so talk to someone further. I didn't get the beginning of that, so therefore it's hard to make sense of that. You're welcome, certainly welcome to schedule a time and see if we're a fit. And Tracy writes, we've been here for 9 years and just heard about the superannuation tax possible in the US. Is this part of the fix the tax treaty conversation? Should we be acting to fix this now to avoid fines? Tracy, yes, is the short answer. Will it help you avoid fines? No, because, but let me back that up a little bit. Will it help you avoid fines? I'm not saying that you will necessarily incur a fine. I think that is dependent on whether you're audited and if you are assessed. However, the opinion of leading practitioners is that indeed you do owe taxes on it. So you'll note there is subtlety in my response to the way I answered your question. Diane, thank you for your question. This will be the last question. I do have to get going. This has gone a little bit over time. Given the lower cost of living in the US, would you say that retiring to the US after having had a working life in Australia would be advisable? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. For the following reason. I mean, it always depends. It always depends. I just said absolutely not. Now I regret it. Other scenarios where that might make sense, possibly. Generally, no. Why? Because you have not vested in Medicare. So now you're talking about your own private insurance, which would, unless you're independently wealthy, probably bankrupt you. You're not, the totalization treaty between the US and Australia does not cover Medicare. So therefore, you've got to figure out the cost of healthcare in the world's most expensive healthcare jurisdiction. You also need to think about aged care, or what's called long-term care in the US, and what coverage that would, how you would obtain that coverage. Medicare covers 100 days in a skilled nursing facility, and that's that. So that would be my financial planner's hat in how I would answer that question. It's been a pleasure all. Please don't keep me a secret. I run these webinars to raise awareness to the Aussie expat community and the Americans in Australia about what we do. So I would love it if you could get the word out. All righty. Thank you very much, and you all have a wonderful evening.